There is a woman sitting alone in her car outside her apartment building. She has not gone inside yet. She is 36 years old. She has a master's degree. She has a job title that sounds impressive at dinner parties. And she is sitting in the dark, engine off, doing the math in her head for the 11th time this week. The math never changes. The number never gets smaller. She was told her entire childhood that if she worked hard enough, she would have everything her parents had and more. Nobody told her the rules would change after she already memorized them. This is not one woman's story. This is the psychological fingerprint of an entire generation. And by the end of this, you are going to understand something about yourself or someone you love that will completely rearrange how you see the last 15 years of your life. Because what happened to this generation was not an accident. It was not laziness. It was not entitlement. It was something closer to a controlled experiment in human psychology, run at scale, without consent, without a control group, and without anyone bothering to check on the results until it was far too late. Stay with me until the end, because the final piece of this puzzle is the part almost nobody talks about, and it changes everything that came before it. The promise that was never going to be kept. Every generation inherits a story about how the world works. For the generation we are talking about today, the story was simple, and it was told with total confidence. Go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a degree, get a job, work your way up, buy a home, build a life. This was not presented as one possible path among many. It was presented as physics, as certain as gravity. Children absorb these stories the way they absorb language, without questioning the grammar. And so an entire generation grew up constructing their identity, their sense of safety, their entire internal compass around a promise that adults around them repeated like scripture. Psychologists call this a schema, a mental framework the brain builds to predict how the world will respond to your actions. Study hard, and the world rewards you. Play by the rules, and the rules protect you. This is not just a belief. It becomes wired into how a person interprets everything that happens to them. Now picture what happens when that schema meets a world that no longer follows the old rules. College tuition does not rise gradually. It multiplies several times over in the span of a single childhood. Entry-level jobs quietly start demanding years of experience that no entry-level position could possibly provide. Full-time careers with pensions and stability begin disappearing, replaced by contract work, freelance gigs, and constant uncertainty. And an economic collapse arrives exactly when this generation is stepping into adulthood, wiping out the job market the moment they need it most. When reality violates a deeply held belief about how the world is supposed to work, the mind does not simply shrug and adjust. It experiences something closer to a fracture. Therapists call this schema disruption, and on an individual level, it is disorienting enough. But when it happens to millions of people at the exact same life stage, at the exact same time, it does not just create disappointed individuals. It creates a psychological rupture at the scale of a generation. You do not get people who are merely unlucky. You get people who fundamentally stop trusting the instructions they were given, while still, somewhere underneath, aching for those instructions to have been true. This is why so many people from this generation describe a strange, split feeling. Part of them still believes effort should be rewarded fairly. Part of them has already concluded that it will not be. They are idealistic and cynical in the very same breath. And that contradiction is not confusion. It is the exact, predictable signature of a broken promise still being processed. And once you understand that this fracture happened at the level of belief itself, you start to see why the next consequence was almost impossible to avoid. A childhood engineered for confidence and nothing else. To understand what came next, you have to go back further, to the nurseries, the classrooms, the soccer fields of the 80s and 90s. Parenting in that era was shaped by a genuine, well-intentioned psychological movement, the self-esteem movement. The theory sounded reasonable on paper. If children believe in themselves, they will achieve more. If we tell children they are special, capable, gifted, they will grow into confident, successful adults. So an entire generation of children grew up hearing it constantly. You can do anything. You are special. Everyone gets a trophy, not just the ones who won. Every school project came home covered in gold stars. Every recital ended in applause, regardless of the performance. Nobody arrived intending harm. Parents genuinely believed they were protecting their children from the shame and self-doubt they themselves had experienced growing up. But psychological research, most notably the work of psychologist Jean Twenge in her research on generational personality trends, found something uncomfortable hiding inside this well-meaning experiment. Children raised on a steady diet of unconditional praise did show higher scores on measures of self-confidence, even narcissism, than previous generations. That part worked, in a sense. But the same research found something else running directly alongside it. Elevated rates of anxiety. Elevated rates of depression. A generation simultaneously more certain of their own specialness and more fragile beneath the surface than the ones before them. Here is the mechanism behind that contradiction. Praise that is tied to effort builds resilience because the child learns that struggle itself has value. Praise that is tied to identity, telling a child they are special simply for existing, builds something more fragile. It builds a sense of self that depends entirely on external confirmation to feel stable. Take away the trophies, take away the constant validation, and what is left underneath is a nervous system that was never actually taught how to sit with failure, because failure was almost never allowed to happen in the first place. So imagine that child growing up. Imagine them walking directly out of a childhood engineered to make them feel limitless into an adult world that offers no trophies for showing up, no gold star for trying hard, no guaranteed reward for effort at all. The gap between what they were trained to expect and what they actually receive is not a small adjustment. It is a canyon. And the way a person's brain responds to falling into that canyon depends entirely on what happens to their sense of self-worth while they are trying to climb back out, which brings us to something even more destabilizing than economics: growing up in public. Every previous generation made their formative mistakes in private. They fumbled through awkward years, said embarrassing things, tried on identities that did not fit, and mostly, nobody outside their immediate circle ever knew. That privacy was not a luxury. It was a psychological necessity. It gave people room to fail quietly, to grow without an audience judging every version of themselves in real time. This generation did not get that privacy. Social media arrived not during their childhood, but during their most psychologically vulnerable window, adolescence and early adulthood, precisely when identity is still being formed. This timing matters enormously. Younger generations grew up with social media as an ambient background from birth. This generation had to learn how to become an adult and learn how to perform an adult identity for an audience at the exact same time, for the first time in human history. Every milestone became content. Every relationship became a public timeline. Every career move, every body, every relationship status, every holiday filtered through a lens of how it would be perceived by hundreds or thousands of people, most of whom were only ever seeing curated highlights of everyone else's life while comparing it to their own unfiltered, unedited, ordinary reality. Psychologist Tim Kasser's research into materialism and psychological well-being found something that applies directly here. When people build their sense of self-worth around external validation, likes, comments, followers, comparisons, their mental health consistently deteriorates. The mechanism is straightforward once you see it. Self-worth that depends on an audience is never actually stable, because the audience is never actually satisfied, and it is never actually done watching. Think about what this means practically. A person cannot simply live their 20s. They live their 20s while running a permanent, unpaid campaign for their own existence, and the polls never close. Every quiet, uneventful day feels like falling behind, because somewhere on a screen, someone appears to be winning at exactly the life this person is supposed to be building. The comparison never rests, because it is not comparing them to one person anymore. It is comparing them to a curated highlight reel assembled from millions of people's very best moments, stitched together into a standard that was never actually achievable by any single human being. This is the quiet, invisible tax this generation has been paying every single day since adolescence, and most of them do not even recognize it as a tax. They think it is simply what being alive feels like now. But there is a reason this constant performance pressure did not simply fade away as they got older. It attached itself to something even more fundamental, the milestones that used to tell a person they had officially become an adult. The waiting room that never opens into the next room. For generations before this one, adulthood arrived through a fairly predictable sequence. Finish school, get a job, move out, get married, buy a home, have children. Each milestone functioned as a kind of psychological checkpoint, a confirmation that life was progressing the way it was supposed to. Reaching these checkpoints did not just change someone's circumstances. It changed how they saw themselves. It gave the nervous system a sense of forward motion, of arrival. This generation wants these same milestones. Survey after survey confirms it. They are not rejecting marriage, home ownership, or family out of some ideological stance. They want these things at rates comparable to previous generations. What has changed is not their desire. What has changed is the math. Wages did not keep pace with the cost of housing. Housing did not keep pace with the cost of living. The cost of raising children climbed in ways that made the decision to have them feel less like a life stage and more like a financial gamble few could responsibly take. So picture someone in their mid-30s, professionally accomplished by any reasonable standard, and still renting a small apartment they know they will likely rent for years to come. Still watching their monthly paycheck disappear into costs their parents never had to face at the same age. Still feeling somewhere underneath the surface, like the real version of their life has not started yet. Like they are stuck in a waiting room, expecting to be called into the next room at any moment, except the call never comes. And the waiting room does not have a clock, only a slowly climbing rent notice. There is a term in psychology for what prolonged, unresolved uncertainty like this does to the human body: allostatic load. It describes the wear and tear that accumulates when the body remains in a low-grade state of stress preparation for extended periods, bracing for a resolution that never actually arrives. Unlike a single, acute stressor that spikes and then fades, this is a slow accumulation, a body constantly primed for a threat it can never fully name or resolve. Over years, this kind of chronic uncertainty does not just affect mood. It affects sleep, immune function, cognitive clarity, and the basic ability to feel settled inside one's own life. This is why so many people from this generation describe a feeling that is difficult to put into words. Not sadness exactly, not failure exactly, something closer to suspension. Like their life is technically happening, but has not actually begun. And when a person exists inside that suspended state long enough, it starts to reshape how they relate not just to their future, but to the very institutions that were supposed to guide them there, which is where something even more misunderstood begins to take root. The loyalty that was never actually broken, only redirected. If you have ever heard someone criticized for job hopping, for lacking loyalty, for not being willing to grind quietly at one company for decades the way their parents did, you have witnessed one of the most misunderstood psychological patterns of this entire generation. The criticism assumes that loyalty simply evaporated, that something was lost, that an entire generation collectively decided commitment no longer mattered. But loyalty is not something a person simply discards. It is something that develops or fails to develop in direct response to the environment around them. Consider what this generation actually witnessed while forming their understanding of what work means. Pensions, once a standard promise of long-term employment, quietly disappeared from most industries. Full-time positions with benefits were steadily replaced with contract work, gig labor, and temporary arrangements offering none of the same security. Mass layoffs, once treated as a last resort in moments of genuine crisis, became a routine cost-cutting strategy, announced in quarterly earnings calls with barely a flinch. A person does not develop deep loyalty to an institution that has already demonstrated, repeatedly and publicly, that it has no loyalty to them. This is not entitlement. This is pattern recognition, one of the most basic and adaptive functions of human cognition. The brain is built to notice when a relationship is asymmetrical, when devotion flows in only one direction, and to adjust its behavior accordingly. Choosing not to sacrifice long-term stability for an employer who has shown no hesitation in discarding people during difficult quarters is not a character flaw. It is a rational recalibration to match a genuinely changed environment. And this same pattern recognition extends far beyond the workplace. This is also one of the most educated, most digitally literate generations in history, one that came of age inside the earliest chaotic wave of internet culture, absorbing wildly different versions of the same events depending on who was telling the story. Growing up inside that environment does something specific to a person's psychology. It builds a deep, almost reflexive instinct to question things rather than simply accept them at face value. People who question systems, who ask why things work the way they do instead of quietly complying, are frequently labeled as difficult, entitled, or ungrateful. But there is a more accurate way to describe what is actually happening. Critical thinking, colliding with systems that were never designed to tolerate being questioned, will always look like defiance to the people running those systems. It is not rebellion for its own sake. It is the direct, logical output of a mind trained to notice inconsistency, applied to institutions that quietly hoped nobody would ever notice. And this same generation did something else almost no generation before them was willing to do openly, something that deserves far more credit than it usually receives, and it leads directly into the final piece of this psychological puzzle: naming the pain out loud while living inside it. For most of human history, psychological struggle was something people were expected to carry silently. Anxiety was weakness. Depression was a character flaw, a private shame to be hidden rather than a condition to be treated. Therapy, when it existed at all, was whispered about, something reserved for crisis, not something a reasonably functioning adult openly discussed at a dinner table. This generation broke that silence. Publicly, deliberately, and at scale. They were the first to widely destigmatize therapy, to talk openly about anxiety and depression as real, treatable conditions rather than private failures to be endured alone. They normalized setting boundaries, naming burnout, seeking help without shame. This shift did not happen by accident. It happened because this generation was living through conditions that made silence no longer sustainable. But here's the detail almost nobody stops to sit with. They did all of this unprecedented, courageous act of psychological honesty, while carrying a weight of stress that was objectively, measurably heavier than what most previous generations faced at the same age. Student debt loads that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. Housing costs that outpaced wage growth by staggering margins. Job security replaced by permanent, low-grade uncertainty. They did not just inherit a harder economic reality. They were also handed the responsibility of solving problems, particularly the long-term future of the planet itself, that they did not create and were never given the institutional power or resources to actually fix. Try to hold both of those facts in your mind at the same time. A generation more self-aware about its own psychology than any before it, and simultaneously more overwhelmed by external pressure than any before it. This is not a contradiction. This is precisely what happens when insight and hardship increase together, side by side, without one ever managing to outpace the other. Self-awareness does not eliminate suffering. It simply means the suffering is finally being witnessed, named, and understood, instead of being buried in silence the way it always used to be. And once you understand that, the question society keeps asking, why are you so anxious? Why can you not simply do what your parents did? Stop sounding like a fair question. It starts sounding almost cruel in its blindness. Because the honest answer was never about effort. It was never about work ethic. It was never about resilience. The honest answer is that an entire generation is responding exactly the way any psychologically healthy human being would respond to a landscape that shifted violently beneath their feet, while still being handed a map drawn for a world that no longer exists. What you have just walked through is not really a story about one generation. It is a story about what happens to the human mind when belief, environment, and expectation stop matching each other. It is a story about how confidence without resilience becomes fragility, How performance without privacy becomes exhaustion. How delayed milestones become a body braced for a future that will not arrive. How broken institutional trust becomes mislabeled as broken character. And how naming your pain out loud, in public, for the first time in generational history, becomes mistaken for weakness, when it is actually one of the most courageous psychological shifts a generation has ever made. Worth was never supposed to be measured by a house, a title, or a milestone reached on schedule. It was never supposed to depend on an audience, a comparison, or a promise someone else made and then failed to keep. The world can change the rules without warning. It has done exactly that before, and it will likely do it again. But the ability to notice the pattern, to name what happened honestly instead of absorbing it as personal failure, that is not fragility. That is the beginning of something far steadier than any of the milestones this generation was told to chase. If this made you see someone in your life differently, or made you see yourself differently, there is another video waiting that goes even deeper into why the mind clings so tightly to the promises it was given as a child and what it actually takes to finally let an old promise go.